Hello. So is there anything in particular you guys would like me to go over tonight? Anything you guys want me to review for you tonight? Nothing in particular? Well, then let me just take a look at, sorry, this is a different class. We don't need that open. At Lab 5. How about that, since that will be due by the end of next week. So you should be pretty well along on Lab 4. Do you guys have any other questions for Lab 4, or is everything cool there? Yeah, go ahead, Liz. What's your question for Lab 4? So PAR is going to be calculated based upon that particular hole. So when you're calculating PAR, what you're going to need to do is you're going to be looping through, because you've got the through num, right? So you're going to calculate PAR for hole 1 and hole 2 and so on up to whatever the hole number is. So let's say the first 3 holes you're going to be calculating PAR on. So you're going to have your loop to take you through the through num. Okay. And then inside the loop, you know what the score is for that particular hole. You know how many strokes it took the golfer to complete, because that's what's actually in your array. So the strokes equals this dot, whatever the array name is, sub I, or whatever your iterator is. So you know the strokes. But the key is you need to know what the par is. You have to figure out what the par is for this particular hole, right? So the whole number that you're actually on is not going to be I, right? It's going to be I plus 1. Oops, that's 1 plus 1. I plus 1. Because the in the array, everything is stored in like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but the 0 element, the first element in position 0 is hole number 1, and the second element in position number 1 is hole number 2, and so on. So our hole number is going to be I plus 1, so we know how many strokes it took them to finish this hole, and we know what the hole number is, but then you have to get the hole, the par. And so par is actually located in, if we come out here into our plus libs folder and click on the doc here, we can look at the whole class, and there is a method here called get par. So we know we can obtain par on the whole, but we have to have the whole object. We need to get that specific whole object. And in order to get that whole object, we have to go to the course, and we have a get whole method for our course. So what we're going to have to do is get our whole object. So the whole object equals course.getWhole, passing it our whole number, right? So that gives us a whole object. And once we have the whole object, now we can do par equals our whole object, dot get par. So now we know how many strokes it took the person to complete the whole, and we know what par is for the whole. And then if you go way back to that very first class we did, the player class, remember par is, or the score versus par is par minus strokes. So our total is going to be the total plus and then par minus the strokes. Okay, so every time through the loop, so you're going to have to, this will be your accumulator variable, so it'll be set to 0 initially, and then each time through you're going to figure out, well, this is how many strokes it took you to finish the whole, this is what the whole actually is, this is the whole object, this is par, and now that I know all that information, then I can add to my total the score versus par. Did you follow all that? It's a lot of work to get to the par. Were you able to determine the number of, you did the strokes in the previous one, right? The compute strokes for the through num. All right, so if we're doing the compute strokes, all right, so we know a through num, okay, right? You know what your through num is. So let's first come up with some examples. Let's say that we have a person, they played hole 1 and it took them 5 strokes, right? They played hole 2 and that took them 3 strokes. They played hole 3, that took them 6 strokes. They played hole 4 and that took them 5 strokes, and then played hole 5 and that one took them 4 strokes, and they haven't played hole 6 yet. They haven't played hole 6. Okay? So if we were to do this, if I would say I want to know how many strokes it took them through hole 3, so 1, 2, and 3, so that would be 5 plus 3 is 8, plus 6 is 14. So my answer should be 14 if I give them a value of through hole 3, right? So it should, I'm only adding up the first 3 holes, which is 5, 3, and 6, so 14. Okay, everybody understands that, right? Okay, so we've got this, and we have this explicit parameter of through num. And that's not spelled right, that's a Thursday num, but through num. And so that is the hole that we want to go through. So the first thing we need to do is figure out, did we even play this hole? Because if you haven't played this hole, then I can't tell you what your score is through this hole. So we need to make sure that this through num is valid. And so there's a couple things we need to make sure. You know, is the through num greater than 0? Right? Because our holes are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up through the course.num of holes, right? Through that constant course.num of holes. So is it greater than 0? Okay. Or you could actually go the opposite way. You could say, is it less than 1? If it is, then return that invalid thing, right? So we could look at that. Then the next thing we need to know is the through num. Is it greater than the number of holes that actually exist on the golf course? Okay, and our number of holes on the golf course, if we go out to the course class, this is a constant num of holes. So we know we have that guy. So it would be course.num of holes. So if it's greater than that, then we know it's not valid either, right? So we'll return whatever that invalid thing is again. Okay, so those are the first 2 checks that are very straightforward, because you're telling me to give you the number of strokes through a hole that doesn't even exist on my golf course. Okay. So then the last thing we need to check is this a hole that was even played by this player? And how do we know what holes have been played by the player? What instance variable tells us the answer to that? So it's actually in the scorecard golf course, or I'm sorry, scorecard card class. What instance variable is going to tell us how many holes have been played by this golfer? No, no. All right, guys, so take a look at your instance variables in the scorecard golf course, or scorecard object. What instance variables do we even have? You have the scores, which is your array, and we have holes played. So which one of those two do you think tells you how many holes you've played on this golf course? Holes played, right? So then we can say if through num is great, I want this to be Thursday num, so just bad typing aside, all right? If Thursday num is greater than this dot holes played, then I haven't even played this hole, right? So again, return whatever is the invalid thing that they want you to return, okay? So that's the beginning part of this method, and this just gets you out of the way. If you get to this point down here, then that through num is valid. So we checked, are you less than 1? Can't have played hole 0 or a negative hole. So get out of the method, exit out, returning invalid. Is it greater than the number of holes, so it's greater than the possible holes on the golf course, then again, get out of this method, return invalid. And last check, is this even a hole that we've played? Is it greater than the holes that have been played? Then leave the method, we're all said and done. Okay, so now if we're here, we know that this through number is valid. And so in this example, through num is 3. So I'm going to start with my loop. So you have a loop, integer I equals. So what's my low boundary of my array? You always start with the low boundary of your array if you want to process things. So what's the lower boundary of my array? The very first element. What's the position of my very first element? So 0. I is less than, so I only want to go up to my through num, and my through num is going to be 3. But remember, if this is hole 1, that's element position 0, right? And hole 2 is element position 1, and hole 3 is element position 2. And my through num, it contains 3 because I'm looking for whole number. So I want my I value to be less than my through num, or my Thursday num. And then we're going to increment by 1. Not less than or equal, because if I did less than or equal, that would be 3, right? So 0, 1, 2, 3, that would get me up through holes 4. And I don't want that. I only want the first 3 holes, so less than my through num. Okay? And then I'm going to add, I'm just adding these up. So before I even get in here, I need to set my accumulator variable, what I'm going to keep my total in, total equal to 0, give it a nice good clean starting place of 0. And then in here, I'm just going to add to my total plus this dot, whatever the name of the array is, scores sub I. And then you just return your total. All right, so questions on all this stuff? Does this make sense to you guys? What do you think? What questions does this bring up? Okay, so versus par, you're just going to take this stuff right here I didn't want to do that. This stuff that I was talking with Liz up here, we're just going to take that, and right here where we've got this, we're going to stick it in here instead. So in order to compute par, it's going to be the par minus the number of strokes it took you, and you're adding that to your total, right? So we need to know how many strokes it took the player to finish, and we know that in position I, right? That tells us how many strokes. We need to know what's par of the hole. And the only place we're able to get par, if you come out to the Java docs, you come to the hole class, there's a get par method in the hole class. But that means I need a hole object, because these methods can only be called on an object of data type hole. And the only way I can get a hole object is if I come to the course class and I call this method get hole. So this is a static method. It belongs to the class. I don't have to create a course object to call this one, but I have to call it from the class. So course.getWhole, and if I look, this getWhole method returns an object of data type whole, but I have to give it the whole number. Okay, so I have to call this method using the whole number of the course class. So I know how many strokes it took me. That's it, whatever the array name is, sub I. Okay, that's my current hole. I also know what my whole number is. It's not going to be I, right? Because I is going to be the element position 0, 1, 2, and so on. So, but my whole number is the element position plus 1. So if it's in element position 0, my whole number is 1. If it's in element position 1, my whole number is 2. If it's in element position 2, my whole number is 3, and so on. So my whole number is going to be I plus 1. So once I have that, I can now call the course method, giving it my whole number, and it's going to return me a whole object. So now I have my whole object. And once I have my whole object, I can now call the get par on that whole object, and that's going to give me my value of par, because that returns an integer value of par. Okay? Once I know par, I knew what my strokes were, I know now what the par is for the whole, I can do par minus strokes, and I can add that to my total. And then when I'm done, I return my total. All right, did you follow that? Yes, don't have to, no reinventions. Okay, what other questions do you guys have for me? Okay, so in your count category, the reason it might not be getting 100% coverage, it could be a multiple of things. All right, so if you think about it, in your count category, you have 4 circumstances, right? You have the circumstance where you're running it, testing for everything that's under par. You have the circumstance where you're running it and testing it for everything that's equal to par. You have the circumstance where you're running it and testing it for everything that's over par. And So are you guys still there? So my internet is not cooperating, but I'm figuring that now that I finally connected it on my phone, it will probably connect and then I'll be able to get back in. So I can't really show a screen since I'm on my phone, but I can at least talk you through where we're at, and then hopefully my connection will reestablish here in a second. If you got, hopefully that'll be better than nothing, right? Okay. So we were talking about the count category and that there's 4 different options, right? Under par, par, over par, and invalid. So when you're testing that, you have to test for all 4 conditions in order to thoroughly test your class. Okay? So you need to call the count category passing it your under par value, and you can do that either passing it the actual value, and I don't know what value you guys specified because that was your choice, right? The suggestion was maybe -1 for under par, 0 for par, and then 1 for over par, but you could have done anything you wanted to, okay? So you need to pass it that and check. Then you need to pass it the value of par and check that. And then you need to pass it the value of over par and check that. And then you need to pass it some completely different value that's not equal to any of those values. So maybe pass it like 79 or 400 or some obscure value and test it. Did you give that a try? And is it still telling you that you didn't have sufficient test cases? Well, and it could be. So if you have all of those test cases, so for par, under par, over par, and then an invalid number, if you have all of those and it's still saying that your test was not sufficient, then what you need to do is you need to take a look at your if conditions. Because really these if conditions don't need to be connected together, right? You can just say if the player is under par, then add it, if my category is under par and the player is under par, then add 1, then that's 1 hole that's under par. Right? So to do that, it's kind of similar to what we've done, what I showed you for the compute versus par. Okay, so you're going to need a loop just like that. But first, before you do anything, instead of validating like we did with the through num, where we checked to make sure that the through num was greater than 0, less than or equal to the number of holes, and that it was an actual hole that had been played, in this case, what you're going to do is you're going to validate the category that's being passed into the method first. So you're going to check and see, is this a valid category? Is it equal to under par, par, or over par? And if it's not equal to one of those 3 things, then you're going to return your invalid, right? So right off of the get-go, before you do any looping or anything, you need to double check for that. Once you've determined the category is valid, then you're going to go into the loop, but your upper boundary is going to be the holes played at this point because we're going to process all the holes that have been played. We're not worried about, there's no through num, so we're going to process all the holes that have been played. Okay? And then inside of that method, what you're going to have to do is then check and say, well, you're going to have to get par, just like we did with the versus par. So you need to get whatever par is for that particular hole. So the same exact steps to get par. And then at that point, once you know the number of strokes, you know the par for the hole, the next thing you want to do is then have 3 if statements, right? If the category is under par, then you're going to check, is my par, are my strokes less than par? And if my strokes are less than par, I'm going to add 1 to that, to my counter, okay? Then a separate, completely separate, no else statement here, 3 separate if statements. So if it's under par, then check, are my strokes less than par? Add 1. Completely different if statement, not connected to anything. If my category is par, then if my strokes are equal to par, then add 1, okay? And then a third completely separate if statement, if my category is under par, and then my strokes are greater than par, add 1 to your counter. Right? And then when you're all said and done, you'll just return whatever your counter is that you've been accumulating. It's hard to do that. My internet is still just cycling through. I was hoping we could get more visual, but were you able to follow that along with just hearing me describe this? Yeah, so if your test cases aren't passing, a lot of times it's because you've embedded you have else's. And so you're creating something in there that it can't reach. And so because of the else's in there, as opposed to making those individual if statements, because you have an else in there, you've created a situation that can never be reached, and therefore it can never be tested. So double check that inside of your method to make sure that you don't have the else's in there, a situation that could never be reached. All right. Do you have an if statement inside the for loop that's checking for an invalid, like a not par? Not par, not under par, not over par? Because that should really be checked before the loop. And so if you checked before the loop and then you're trying to check again inside the loop, it could never reach it. Well, that's about all I got. I mean, without being able to look at your code, and unfortunately with my internet down, I can't even get onto WebCat to take a look. But if you send me an email, because it's in WebCat that you're getting those, right? You're getting things saying that it's unable to test everything. Yeah, shoot me off an email and I can take a look in WebCat and see what WebCat's doing for you, but unfortunately it may not be tonight, seeing as how my internet is still not cooperating. There was a second method that you were saying that it wasn't testing sufficiently, so it was the count category, and what was the format. I'm not sure about the format one because that should have all been, all the test cases for that should have been provided. Well, use the driver program to print it out and then double check to see what you're testing for. You know, you've done that before where you use the same data from your test cases in the driver program. All right, well, you guys have, sorry about this. Does anybody have any other questions that I can give it a shot trying to answer here? Well, I was hoping to go over Lab 5, but it doesn't look like that's going to be our reality for tonight. So what I may do is just do a recording of Lab 5 and publish it out, post it out for you guys, because I hate to wait until next week when, there's the final and everything else. Either that or Thursday we'll go over Lab 5 at the meet session on Thursday. But I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me here, and I know this is not the best way to do a meet session, but better than nothing, I suppose. Well, don't worry about, think more about all that you've learned in this course. That's really the more, the purpose of the course is not necessarily, I know it's easy for me to say, but um, the purpose of the course is to learn the material more so than getting a stellar, final grade, right, in the course. So just focus on all the, like, look back at where you started to where you are today and think how amazing that journey has been, right? All right, so we're just going to have to call it a night. My internet is still blinking. I think I'm going to have a conversation with my internet provider here. Um, but yeah, so I appreciate you guys sticking around. Hopefully Thursday will be much more productive, but at least I'm more prepared in that I have all this stuff set up on my phone now. So we will see you guys